Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we're going to dive into Plasticity 2024.1. Now, this represents a new release of Plasticity, and it's also an anniversary. Plasticity has been out for a little bit over a year now, and it shows that there is a commitment to not only improve what's already there, but to add new features. So in this video, we cannot cover everything that has changed, but if you look at the description of the video, we'll put a bulleted list to show you the minor and major updates, things to consider if you're looking at updating your license of Plasticity. So the one thing that I want to get across in this video is that there are a couple of updates that can fundamentally change your workflow in Plasticity. So I want to highlight those and then have some honorable mentions at the end. Now, remember, we are a Plasticity affiliate, so if you're purchasing either the Indie or Studio license, you can use the code LEAD10 at checkout, and that'll get you 10% off. So the first tool, which is not really new, is the Offset Face tool. Now, this is something that we use all the time. For example, if we select this face and hit O on the keyboard, we can offset the edges, and then we can pull this up into 3D. There's nothing new about the Offset Face tool in that regard. However, we now have the inclusion of what's going to be called a dependency option. Now, as we drag this out and we select another face, this is going to give us essentially the match face operation. That dependency will allow us to move around, make different selections. And for example, if I want to switch it to this side, and I can offset this face either inward or outward. The reason that's important is because now we can use it for things like cutaways that are offset from a specific face, or we can create objects that have a constant or a nice consistent fitment between them. This is not only limited to a single face on a solid body, but if I begin pulling this out in this direction and select this complex surface, you can see that it's able to even extend past the edge of the surface. And once again, we can pull this in and create those complex intersections or overlaps between different bodies. So this is a wonderful addition to the Offset Face tool. And again, Offset Face has been there for as long as Plasticity has been around. But this is a nice improvement because now we don't have to go to the Match Face tool to do some of these things. There is also an update to the Extend Sheet option for surfaces, which behaves in a very similar manner. So for example, if I select that solid body, this is going to extend the sheet to that solid and also trim the sheet at the same time. So once again, it kind of saves you a couple of additional steps that you have to do. If you were trying to extend that sheet up to a specific face, trim it away. Now you can do it very quickly and easily with just that one step. Let's go ahead and hide these and let's talk about the next and probably the most impressive addition for me to Plasticity, and that's called Raise Degree. Now before I get into Raise Degree, I'm going to make a couple of fillets on the corner of the solid body simply by making that selection. Also note that we can use Control. If we select a body and we use Control and Alt, we can select all the vertical edges on that same face to make that selection process a little bit quicker. So now we've got this sort of simple shape. It's just a box with some fillets on the corner. But let's say that we want to turn it into something more complex. Generally, what you do is start creating some 3D curves, make some sheets or surfaces, replace the face, or maybe break it apart and patch it and stitch it together. Well, now what we can do is we can select a planar face, and we can do what's called Raise Degree. As soon as we do Raise Degree, we're essentially turning this into a sub-D surface. Now, it's not truly a sub-D surface, but we're taking a planar surface and making it a spline surface with CVs. What this means is that we can take these CVs and we can begin manipulating them, creating a complex shape. It goes a bit further than that because we can continue to do this, and every time we run the tool, it's going to allow us to divide it up, giving us these extra CVs that we can then manipulate. So for example, I can now pull them up. Creating something like this before by doing it manually by creating surfaces or sheets and then trimming away or cutting away a solid or replacing a face, that could take quite a bit more time. And now we have the option to use these CVs and just manipulate them quickly. Now, the CVs themselves actually do a pretty good job of adjusting even when we have things like fillets in the design. You'll notice that the CVs extend past the original face because they're using the untrimmed version of it. But let's go ahead and let's take these three CVs on this side. I'm going to select this one, and this one, and I'll use G and Z and move it up. Notice that the fillet is moving with it. It gives it the ability to adjust its chord width. You can see it's getting wider as we go up, it's getting narrower as we go down, and it is able to handle those changes. There will be a limit For example, if you divide this up too much, it may have trouble actually updating those surfaces. But so far, I found that this is an extremely powerful tool. You can do it to additional faces like these fillets here, but it gets a bit crazy because now what we're doing is we're creating a situation where we've just got way too much control, too many CVs on here. So for example, if I scale this down, let's hit S and S and try to scale this, nothing's happening. And you can see as soon as it starts to update, things go a little crazy, but it is still trying to produce something for us. But this is just something that you have to be careful with a tool like this. My suggestion is to avoid adding too many fillets or rounded corners. Play around with using the raise degree tool first, get the overall shape, and then go back and add those details. Because once you start adding too many details, you're really just taxing the tool. Now that we've added these using raise degree, how do we get rid of them? Well, they are going to be a part of the surface, but we can select the body or the individual faces, and we can go to the tool called toggle points. Now, toggle points allows us to turn them on and off. It's not removing them, but if we want to simply hide them while we're doing additional modeling operations, we can do that with toggle points. So I think that that is going to have probably the biggest or most drastic impact on workflow, especially if you're dealing with complex shapes and traditionally you go straight to creating those sheets with complex 3D curves. Now, the tool that probably most people are interested in talking about is xNurbs. Now, I think xNurbs is extremely powerful. I think it's a wonderful addition to Plasticity. And in other CAD systems, typically when you have xNurbs, it's a several $100 add-in, and it's something that works in the same way in other CAD programs as it does in Plasticity. However, understanding what it actually is can be kind of tricky. We will do a dedicated video talking about xNurbs, but I want to highlight just a couple of things here. First, I'm going to start the xNurbs tool. When we have the xNurbs tool active, it's asking us to select boundaries and guides. Now, for these examples, we're only going to focus on boundaries with no internal guide rails, but let's highlight sort of the differences and the similarities between something like the loft tool. Now, if we were going to loft from this edge to this edge, we could have G1, G2, or G0 connected continuity. Everything at this point is essentially the same between the xNurbs tool and the loft tool. You can create the same thing. You can go to a quad-sided patch, which will actually give you quite a nice result when we're talking about using the xNurbs tool. But in most cases, it's going to give you a very similar, if not identical, result to the loft tool. Where things start to differ is when we begin to add more selections. If we say add this edge here, now the xNurbs tool can actually continue to build out a patch that fits those. The loft tool, however, would go from this first edge to the second edge and try to transition into this third edge. It gets worse if we try to add more, and it just keeps going. But the xNurbs tool is looking at these as boundaries and not specifically an order of operations for going through profiles. So what this allows us to do is build out these complex networks without having to create complete closed profiles like we would with the patch tool, or building out this complex network of loft profiles to go from start to end of our shape. We can manipulate it with G1, G2, or G0 continuity, and there are a whole host of additional options in here. My suggestion is to only use quad-sided when you're dealing with a true four-sided patch, and to leave all the rest of the settings as is until you have a little bit more seat time with this tool. Playing around with the quality, the boundary settings, and even the flatness can produce some undesirable results, and the default settings are pretty good. So if we right-click, that is a surface that you could not produce with any other tool that I'm aware of. So that's probably one of those use cases that you're going to see quite a bit, somebody creating this complex patch between all these other areas. So that is obviously one case where xNurbs has definitely got my vote for a useful tool in Plasticity. However, there are a couple of other use cases where it may not be so apparent. So what we're going to take a look at here is this common condition where we've got a shape that's transitioning and we need to fill it in with a surface. Now, what we would typically do is hold down the Alt key, select this boundary, and we go to our patch tool. Now, the patch tool works pretty well. We can set it to G1 continuity for tangency, but generally when we have this many boundaries on an n-gon or multi-sided patch, it's not going to allow us to do G2 continuity, which is taking a look at the tangency and the radius of curvature at those edges. Now, because the surrounding edges are essentially extrudes and the side edges here have a little bit more curvature in 3D, it technically will complicate that process. And when we use the patch tool, what ends up happening is that becomes part of the original body. So I'm going to use Alt-J and then just move it out of the way so we can take a look at the xNurbs tool. So doing the same thing, holding down Alt, I'm going to go to the xNurbs tool. And again, G0, G1 continuity, and we can actually use G2 continuity here as well. I'm going to use G1 just to give it a fair comparison with the patch tool. Again, leaving all the other settings as default. Looking at this from the front, it doesn't appear that they're very different. But if we take a look at some of our options up here, such as our zebra stripes, one thing that you're going to notice is there are going to be slight variations here. And I want to point out two things. One is going to be this transition here. On the patch, this is essentially straight and then it arcs down, while when we look at this on the xNurbs surface, it's more of a gradual arc. That might not seem like very much, but we have the same sort of story over here. We've got these sections, they're a little bit more straight, while on the xNurbs patch, they're a little bit more smooth. Now, what does that really mean for you? Well, it does have an effect when we take a look at things like shadows and reflections. When we look at shadows and reflections, what you're going to find is on the patch tool, in some cases, you're going to get a much more harsh transition when you have a complex patch like this that includes more than 4 sides. The xNurbs tool is definitely better suited to that. And again, we use G1 continuity and we didn't use any of those advanced options. But that's probably not the best use case to say you should buy the studio version just because xNurbs is there. There are going to certainly be many overlapping situations where you could pick either the Loft tool or xNurbs or the Patch tool or xNurbs. So again, we will do a dedicated video talking more about the workflow, how to use xNurbs, and how it compares to things like Lofts and Patches in those situations. But those are going to be the main things that I wanted to highlight. However, I do want to talk about a couple of additional honorable mentions. Now, there are going to be some things that have updated that are pretty minor, but they do make somewhat of a big deal. Now, I'm going to talk about the first one here, and that's the pipe tool. So if we just select an edge and we hit P on the keyboard for the pipe tool, in the past, we had a complicated gizmo or widget on the screen to control the pipe tool. There was a widget for the diameter and one for the thickness. And oftentimes, if you grabbed one, you would end up grabbing the thickness version and not the diameter. So the update for the 2024.1 version has simplified that. So all we have is to affect the diameter of this, which makes it much easier. And it's the typical use case when using the pipe tool to say trim away an edge. So that is an update that I think is probably not going to make a huge difference, but it will help reduce some of that frustration when you do use that pipe tool. The next thing that I do want to mention is going to be some of the behaviors when creating curves. Now, this is probably one that's going to hang a lot of people up because if you're following any tutorials, whether they're from this channel or any other channel, this functionality has changed. And essentially what's happening is now whenever you're creating a curve, as soon as you left click, you're going to continue to add those curves. So for example, here with the line tool, but as soon as you right click, it's going to end and accept. Now, in the past, what would happen is you'd have to right click twice, but now it's only a single right click. Now, this is true for things like the circles, and it's also true for rectangles, for polygons, etc. So why does this matter? Well, in general, this is actually going to help your workflow be a little bit quicker. But if you do happen to use the dimension dialogs, for example, tab over to this one, and you hit the enter key, it's going to end that operation, which means that now you're going to have to use equals to go back to your dimension dialog to manually enter those values. The good news is the dimension can now be used on things like circles. It wasn't available in the past, but it's not available on everything. You can't use it on lines or polygons. So just pay close attention. If you are using these tools, you want to make sure that you tab over to those dimensions before you hit confirm or hit enter. There is one other thing that you can do. If you tab over and you enter a value, you can hold down shift and hit enter, and it'll keep you on this tool without confirming or ending it until you right click. Another thing that I want to mention is going to be the additional MatCaps. Now, we've had MatCaps in Plasticity for quite a while, but now there are a couple of new ones. We've got draft analysis, which will show you where there's positive and negative draft. We can't technically change what that degree value is to the best of my knowledge, but you can see at least if there's positive, negative, or zero draft. We do have some additional zebra stripe options, and there are some new default MatCaps. So we can turn these on and we can take a little bit better look at our designs by using these MatCap options. Another thing that we can do is make our own custom MatCaps, which is kind of a neat feature, but we're not going to be talking about that here. So keep in mind that all of these additions, some of them are considered minor updates, but other ones like the addition of xNurbs or the addition of raised degree, those in my mind are a little bit more major updates in terms of functionality and tools. There's one last thing that I want to mention before we finish off this video, and that's the shortcuts. So whenever we're using shortcuts, in the past, when we tried to add a new shortcut, so for example, if we went to Bridge Edge, right-clicked and assigned a shortcut, if we pressed a key on the keyboard and there was a conflicting shortcut, it wouldn't let you know. Now it's going to show up in red, so you can know that there's already a shortcut assigned to that. So then we can right-click and just simply remove that and try another one. So that's something that's nice. In the past that really wasn't there. You could accidentally apply an incorrect shortcut that applied to 2 or more tools. So those are some of the major and minor updates for the 2024.1 version. As I mentioned in the description of the video, I'll put a bigger list so you can kind of see all of those that are there. If you have any questions on anything you saw here, please leave a comment. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.